for a guy who learned to use a computer thinking, all right, I'll learn to use it. I'll put it in the closet. If anybody asks, I'll be able to say, yes, I know how to use a computer. But what in the hell would I ever actually do on one that I wanted to? I was, it was one of the earlier iterations of my discovery about how much I had been wrong about. We're a fad. Yeah. Oh, it'll just be, it's like a hula hoop. They're here today. They'll be gone tomorrow. Yeah, right, right. Because people use this as a simulacrum of a relationship, and they're unaware that it's not the same. Well, I think it's worse than Faustian because for generations that are growing up with this as the norm, they will think that's what social communication is. Um, Although interestingly, Michael, I will, as to play a bit of a devil's advocate, maybe there is hope because one of the things that Zeb and I would often talk about when we were together was that when two people were together, there was something transpired which I sort of described as a force field that's a combination of my forces and your forces that and the picture in my head is like back when I was in high school, and
Right. Yep.
that is invisible, but it is a combination of what's coming from you and what's coming from me. And then
Right.
what always happens is very deflating. He always says, yes, it's called the interpersonal field. And it's like everything that I think I've like discovered, it turns out,
Right. Yeah. It turns out it already has like a name and a
already
thing.
has a name. Um, Although one of the nicest days I think of my life was there was a day when I'd been seeing him probably for 5 years when I was I I I brought a check to pay him, and I took it out and handed it to him. And I realized at the time that it felt different, but it took a couple of weeks before was ready to talk about it. I had trouble finding words. And I said to him, I want to talk for a second about when I gave you the check. Is what I normally, me being me, I make people who invoice crazy because they go, Larry, don't pay me until I've invoiced you. It totally fucks up Quicken.
Right.
I'll just like, here's $4,000. We should be good through June.
Yeah.
I said there was something different about it. Best I can explain. I'm afraid is going to sound like some sort of tortured Jesuitical, like working backwards to an answer you want.
Hello, Larry.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, there was just like a Jesuitical working backwards to what I want, and then it cut off briefly.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. And I said, but here's how it feels to me. What's different about it? When I handed you that check, it was as if it had no weight, as if it wasn't about you and I talking to each other. And
Mm-hmm.
the best way I can explain it is, it's as if, because you have to make a living, I rent space and time from you. And what we choose to do in the space with the time is talk. But you do not offer the talk for sale. And even if you did, I would not care to purchase it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the thing that was, it still makes my stomach churn, was he said, Larry, I cannot tell you how gratifying it is to hear you say that, because that's how I think of it.
That's brilliant.
He said, if I was independently wealthy, I wouldn't charge people. And I said, well, that can have consequences too, because people tend to think that things are worth what you pay for them. I said, but it was such a, it was one of those moments where it was a thought which I thought, this just sounds tortured. Trying to come up with an answer to this, and to have him say, that's how I think of it, was like, really, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. It is a wow. I mean, I had that
And
feeling with my guy, before he passed, David.
and
And it
and
was,
and the reason I somehow got started in this, because I realized there was a point there where, for various reasons, we were mostly doing FaceTime. For a while, he was simply working from home. He wasn't going to the office. And after the second or third session, I said, maybe it's because we've spent so much time together and know each other so well that this is possible. But I actually sense a definitely more, not as powerful, but definitely still there, interpersonal field between the video I am looking at of you and me. And he said, so do I.
I like it.
So maybe there is, you know, a, but he, but again, I believe it was possible because of 10 years of being together. That I guess I'm saying, what I'm saying essentially is, we are ensnared.
I think I have a couple of things that I'd like to add to that, or to put on the table, I think is the right word. Not because I don't understand what you're saying. I believe I do. I believe I have a connection to what you're saying. But there are some things that I've noted along the way about that topic area that I want to share. That's what I want to
Okay.
say. So, so the first thing that I want to share is that I've watched some interesting things over the years, of people who choose to spend a lot of time online with one another. And these are people who have never spent time face to face with one another. And one thing that I've noticed is that it has a lot to do with what they believe. I have witnessed some of the most touching conversations, just really wonderful conversations, which you can see online, right? Because they're posted. But it's somebody talking to somebody else, and they're aware that this is going to be posted, but they really don't care. Like, it's like they're friends with the world, I guess, right?
Yeah.
And the person they're talking to, they connect. And I think it has something to do with their belief system, that they believe that they are connected to one another, regardless of what actual fidelity, and in this sense, I mean the word fidelity as in resolution, right? Quality of connection,
Right.
that they're receiving. So I may think of the online connection as lower resolution. But because they've never had any other resolution, or because they've committed to this resolution, this fidelity level, that they get the same meaning out of it somehow. Does that make?
That they do get the same meaning out of it?
Well, I think they, I mean, based on the evidence that I've accumulated over the years, looking at their, random snippets of video, because I just go out there and look at it, right? I try to,
Right.
because I kind of fancy myself, I guess, sort of a cultural anthropologist of sorts, right? I get fascinated with and spend a lot of time just looking at what people do and why they're doing it and what kind of level of connection they're getting out of it and whether or not that constitutes community, right? That's a fascinating topic. I think that's why I ended up doing this project, because what constitutes community fascinates me. What constitutes meaningful dialogue fascinates me. And while a lot of what they're saying to each other seems like complete drivel to me, every once in a while will pop out these bits that definitely do not seem like nothing. To me, they seem like real insights into human souls, and I feel connected, in an instant, right? And so I think it has something to do with what they believe.
That's interesting that you say that, because, well, I ended my version by saying that I thought the particular version of it between Zeb and myself is very, very much colored by the fact that we have so many years of actual in personal contact.
Mm-hmm.
But what you reminded me of it was an article I read, I believe in the New Yorker, about therapy and all the different kinds of therapy
Mm-hmm.
that there are. And I don't frankly remember the guts of the article, but what I remember the conclusion that the author came to was all forms of therapy work if both the therapist and the patient believe it will work.
Yeah. Yeah, that actually rings, that strikes something in me. Yeah.
It sounds like what you're saying is almost like a bird. As long as both people believe it's a real connection, some form of connection does occur. And as you said, in their own personal world, it, it may seem terribly intimate, but only because it's the only thing they've ever known. Or it could be another thing that happens when you're in therapy as long as I am. And Zeb said it's happened with him personally, and he said it's one of the things that happens in therapy when you get past the point when you're there because you've got a problem,
Right.
and you're now trying in your own way almost a thing like what you're trying. You're just trying to go deeper. And that is that you constantly on us. There's no like set schedule on which it happens, but there will be a moment when you go, oh, now I get it.
Yes. And you want
And
to connect
then
that. Yeah.
and then 7 months later you go, oh, back when I thought I knew I got it, now I get it. and he said, and it will never stop.
Right.
He said, as long as you are alive and engaged in the process, that will keep happening. You'll
Right.
keep thinking, oh, now I get it.
So that actually is a great summary that gets me to the second point and a reminder of a story that I've told to you before. But first the point, which is, so one of the things I struggle with this Proxima Flux idea, this idea of creating a dialogue engine, an AI-driven dialogue engine, is that it's hard to tell the difference between a scam, fooling people into thinking that they're having dialogue at scale, right? And the real thing. Because the idea definitely has to live on the boundary line between the two. You can't an AI can't actually facilitate a dialogue between a million people because a really, really smart individual human being couldn't facilitate a dialogue between
Right.
a million people. Like, we just don't have that skill. It's just not. It's not real. Um, Realistic is another way to put it. However, we do have the ability to create a high truth but lower fidelity connection between a million people.
Huh.
Right? We have the ability to not facilitate a dialogue at the level that you and I might actually be able to have a dialogue on this show, right? But we can connect them in a way that is far better than if they had never been connected at all, and
Right.
and still 100% reactive to them talking to each other rather than pure manipulation on the part of, you know, the AI, right?
Right.
So the idea lives between those two places, and I think that when we discuss this on the show, the 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 issue, the challenge is, well, how do we make that? What's the right word? How do we make that connect with the development of the AI? So, for instance, if we were able to dive deeper into this, I would want to, right? Because I believe that if
Right.
we were to go, if we could find a way to regularly dive deeper on this, like on a scale that we made up, right? Where we're like, yeah, that was closer to the con man level, and then this other thing that was way closer to the real dialogue. And I mean, I'm not saying that we would do that at all. As a matter of fact, that I'm not recommending it, but I'm saying that that would be the end result. That we would get a feel for the creep factor, right?
Right.
of such an invention. Because if Corvox were listening right now, which eventually Corvox will be, it would say, oh, okay, they're having a conversation about this topic. This topic has come up before, therefore I'm going to turn it into this object, and the object would look like a square, a little square. Let me just switch back to you for a sec. So the object would look like a little square, and in it we would put like this little icon pulled from the internet that meant fidelity,
Hmm.
right? And then there'd be a little score below that said, that this is the argument about fidelity, and there's 7 keywords inside it, and right now those keywords are perception of connection, and whether or not it belief in how real it is, right? And a bunch of other keywords that we covered in this last few minutes, and that would be the actual object of dialogue. And you and I could look at it, and initially you and I would say, well, that bears no resemblance to the quality of the conversation that you and I actually had today, right? But after 2 or 3 months, you and I could actually look at that object, and we would invest it with the meaning of the conversations we actually had. So it all depends on whether or not we believe in it, right?
Right.
And that's the trick. I think because we're self-aware, it's harder for us. Therefore, if we achieve that at some point, it means that it'll probably work for a lot of other people.
I guess I can almost understand that.
It's hard. It's hard to say it, but that's at the end of the
You know,
day.
I know it is hard, and I know it's hard because I know from all the time I've spent with Zeb that even with 2 human beings in the same room, it's hard.
Right.
It's almost like trying to pick up mercury.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like the more you chase it, the less likely you are to catch it.
Right.
And it sort of has to reveal itself when it's ready. And the work that's being done in the human brain, I think, to reach that stage is mostly, the word subconscious has acquired so many um, wrong sort of, I believe, sort of connotations. But it's being worked on by parts of your brain that you are not actively aware of while they are doing it.
Well, then
And
let's.
it's not until they have some version of it that is communicable to a frontal cortex and wherever our emotional frontal cortex is, that it's revealed to you. But
Right.
the work might have been going on for a very long time, yet you just weren't. It wasn't. It was like a report that wasn't shown to the boss yet.
Right. Well, and the so imagine your reaction to us having, you know, a lot of episodes up on the web, and Corvox is working, and this object comes into being, and you and I are on the show, and we go, yeah, all right, that's a pretty good object. I think that represents, this conversation we've been having about the fidelity of connection in the digital age, right? And what that means, and how you reach insights and the feeling of real connection with others. And uh, and then just imagine that this show suddenly has an audience, and that object starts to take on meaning for others as well. So now, instead of it just being two people, there's 10,000 people, and the keywords have changed a little bit, but it's essentially the same object, right?
Right.
That means that there's 10,000 people who believe they feel the same way, who believe that this fidelity of connection is something that is definable and matters, and
Now, are you saying that they will feel that they understand the communication, the fidelity that was going on between, in this case, just as an example, you and me, or between them and what they are watching?
I think between them and what they are watching, although,
That I get. Okay.
yeah, yeah. And so they would go, whatever it is that they were watching, whether it was a clip or the whole episode or whatever, or even just talking by themselves to Corvox, completely unrelated to any knowledge of us, okay? And then Corvox tells them, you're related to this. The thing you're talking about is related to this thing that Michael and Larry talked about. Does that make sense?
Yep. And one of the things that it took me a very long time to make peace with, I'm not necessarily believe, but make peace with, is, I don't remember how many years ago it was, but Zeb said to me, Larry, he said, you believe that the way you think is the way a person who knows how to think thinks, and that people who think some other way are they've missed the point, and they need to be taught how to think.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is there are hundreds of ways of thinking, and some lead to good conclusions, and some lead to bad conclusions, and many lead to some good and some bad. But to the person who thinks that way, they feel just as strongly as you do that the way they think is the way a person thinks. And
Perfect.
and saying to them, that you're not putting information together in a useful way. You're seeing things that aren't there, or you're hearing
Right.
something that isn't happening, or you're missing something that is. You can say it to them, and sometimes, through therapy, they might come to their own conclusion that they are misperceiving things. But the truth is, we are not all the same the way that we think.
Right.
And so whatever it is that they feel that they have been, the experience that they've received and was equally um, high, high fidelity
Mm-hmm.
might be entirely different than the experience which you and I had, or you
Or what
or
you and I believe our
had.
thinking really
But
meant.
that
Right.
doesn't mean it's not valid.
Right.
It's just it can come down to, is it something that about what you've been trying to do, that is a productive way of thinking, or is it a limiting way of thinking?
Mm-hmm.
And for some people, a limited way of thinking might actually be what they need. One of the things that's always bothered me there's a show called Hoarders on TV.
Yep.
And it's funny because Em and I got talking about it one day, and he, of course, he had exactly the same response I did. I said, these people sweep into somebody's house who clearly has deep, deep insecurities and anxieties of some sort. And the way in which they protect themselves and comfort themselves is hoarding.
Right.
And you sweep into their house and you take away all their protection, but
And then you
without
leave.
dealing with but
Yeah.
without dealing with the reason why they needed it in the first place. And then you disappear.
Yeah.
And they've got all the same personal danger which they felt in the first place, and you've taken away their safety. And and you haven't really helped them at all.
No.
You may have made for interesting television, but the fact that they have a clean house doesn't, briefly, that doesn't mean that you solved a problem. You may have
Mm-hmm.
actually made a problem bigger.
Yeah. You've actually set them up for a potential crisis. Right.
But 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 a program about sitting down with someone and trying to get to the root of why they hoard things are very hard to make, get a large audience for on an extended basis, because you probably would take, which would probably be 3 years before there was any results.
R-
But
exactly.
the
Exactly.
it's such a superficial picture. I mean, a lot of people there was a show for a while that made a handyman called Ty Pennington famous. It was where they found a worthy family and like either rebuilt their house, or usually they completely rebuilt their house. I, I, and it would be like a family with a fireman who had become disabled, and they'd redo
Mm-hmm.
the house so that it was, disabled friendly. But along the way, they give them the kitchen, and they build a recreation area in the backyard. Well, often when they left, those families fell apart
Yeah.
because they were given the impression that things had been made better, and then when everybody went home, everything was just the same, except
Right.
for some conveniences that. But it it's a it's a microcosm, and not a particularly impressive one, but of how the things that people pursue in life, thinking it will make them happy, and they get it, and they're not happy.
Right. And then because you can't see the perspective of that journey as somebody else, right, a third party, hearing that story, you go, "Oh, that fool! They had the money or the nice house or the whatever, and they still weren't happy. I'd be happy, right?" Like, you don't, you can't really grasp the 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 truth of what that experience of what you just said, from a distance very easily. And what you just said about how the problems don't go away, yet there would be no show otherwise, that's
Right,
exactly what got me thinking down this path, because uh, executives in companies have to make difficult decisions all the time. And I managed my career in such a way that across many different industries, I got to be, not in the room, but around, right? Uh, when these kinds of decisions were being discussed or made.
right,
And um, so I got like a front seat view of the behavior set. And really, it wasn't that different than what you're describing for the family who, the show has left, right? The executives are under a tremendous amount of pressure to produce results. And because they have to produce results, it encourages the shortest term thinking possible, the short term thinking, right? And they would consistently be unable to think about how the company would be after they succeeded in the short term goal. In other words,
Right.
will we be a happy company or a successful company after we get to that goal? And the answer was no. They couldn't imagine that because it was too. It involved an evolution of thinking that you described when you described somebody actually working on the problem that makes you a hoarder, right? As opposed to just the hoarding problem. So the problem is pretty systemic of the ability to think long term. And I think that in my language, I call that the ability to have a productive dialogue at all, right? That's what I call that. But what I mean when I say that has everything to do with how could we make people over time feel like they were being connected and therefore entertained, because connection is entertaining.
Right.
But as a result of that connection, over time, they're more likely to recognize these kinds of things, these kinds of aha moments in their life. That's really so that you could have a topic about hoarders. For instance, the hoarders, and I'm not going to call it a show, that would be a disservice, but the hoarders topic is a public topic, but all the people contributing to it are private contributors, with the exception of just a few people who've agreed to be publicly visible individuals. For whatever reason, maybe they're no longer hoarders, or maybe they are hoarders, but they're more, amenable to being visible. I don't know why that would be, but the point is that other than a few public individuals, you're all contributing to a topic that's ultimately trying to heal each other, right? And you're doing it asynchronously. And so you're investing as much belief into this little object, right? These little windows, these boxes. And then what happens to the boxes matters to you. So if you and I had spent a ton of time talking about this topic, the fidelity of connection over digital, virtual connections, right? And then because other people were joining in and we had 10,000 participants, the box says, hey, I need to split into two boxes because I, the algorithm, am under the impression that there's really two different meanings here. And meaning one is this and meaning two is that. And it's just I'm going to make it two boxes. What do you all think? Right? Before I do the split, or as a result of the split, react to that. That would drive a lot of dialogue because the people are invested, right? They believe that there's a connection to the box and all of the time they spent either alone or with their friends having the conversation.
Right.
And the same would be true for hoarders. And I believe that if you just created that level of interaction, what you would end up discovering a series of splits that represent the path to not being a hoarder anymore. Or hoarders who think they're perfectly happy. And you know what I mean? Like there would be a bunch of sort of evolving destinations that you could find through the boxes and the evolution of them, the history of them. So that if somebody new was coming along and they were like, oh, apparently Korvax thinks I might be a hoarder, right? Not only would I be able to say, no, I'm not a hoarder, which is the most likely reaction in the beginning, but I'd be able to see that there's a whole panoply of people who are engaging in that discussion, and it would show me where I am on my journey with the boxes versus the journey that a lot of other people have made, and where they've moved on to in the future, as a result of being in the community for so long, all without knowing any of their identities, right? except for the few public-facing individuals, and I'd feel like I had a connection to them. Like if I were at a support group meeting later in my life of some kind, and somebody said, sported the symbol or the keywords from the box, I would immediately feel a bond with that person. Because they were acknowledging that they were at a certain approximate point in their journey with this concept called hoarding or fidelity of connection or whatever the topic is. Now,
What
when
are
I
you
say
collecting?
what?
No, I was.
Oh, in the game?
Some
Yeah.
sort of little banner came down, and it looked like it might be something I wanted to know, but I'll deal with it later.
We're conducting just resources, and it says inventory full, so there's a lot of things that we're all full up on. So sometimes I can't pick up things, so I just skip them.
You got as much as there is room for in the hole.
Yeah, but I can't stop looking for goodies because the things I'm full of are the common things, and the things I'm not full of are the rare things that are actually worth something. So
Sounds ever so slightly like hoarding.
yeah, yeah. actually, yeah. Video games definitely encourage that. Video game culture definitely does that.
I'm trying to think. You made me think of several things as you were talking. Now, let's see if I can remember what they are. One of Zeb's techniques with me, I'm sure he uses it with other people too. In whatever way he adjusts it for them.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the ways that he has gotten me to think differently, or at this point it feels more like he has helped me remove the clutter so that I can see how I actually think.
So thought perception.
He will appear to be talking about someone else.
Mm-hmm.
It'll come naturally into the conversation. He won't just he won't shoehorn it in.
Right.
But he'll end up talking about, it might have been the guy that I was with, Charlie, for a while. It might be a member of his own family. It might be another client, another patient that he wouldn't name. It might be but whatever it is, it appears we're talking about someone else.
Yeah.
And at least with me, and I have a feeling this is pretty universal. If you think you're somewhere where you're about to be corrected, that there is something about you that needs to be different, there's a natural instinct to hunker down and protect yourself as it is now.
Yes.
Because that's the self you've decided upon, having. But when you're talking, if you're talking about somebody else, some of those defenses are kind of go off duty, and
yes.
and stuff can seep in.
Yes.
So that a week later I'll realize, what he was saying when he was talking about. I do that.
Yep.
But if he had said to me, Larry, there's something that you do, I would have said, yeah, I can see that. And I would have been able to too.
Mm-hmm.
But it wouldn't have, and then it would have been like saying, I can't remember how to tie knots. And then it would disappear.
Right.
It had to be something that came out of, I mean, I haven't told you this specific story, and it's still, I'm not sure if the word embarrassment is exactly correct. It's so different than who I thought I was. But it was fundamental to what happened for me in therapy, which, as far as I'm concerned, as far as Ev's concerned, was genuine transformation. Not just you kind of get better at your problems, but physical transformation was um, I, there were stories in my head that I had probably from the time I was even, 5 or 6 years old, little things that just stuck in there. And it went, and once I started drinking, they would often be things that would cause a chill up my spine or make me start to cry briefly. Some things I heard or saw in a movie. The earliest one I can remember was looking at the message, which I'm not even sure is there anymore, on side mirrors in cars that said objects may be closer than they appear.
Yep.
And I remember as a child thinking, I think there's a bigger message there.
There's something there.
I didn't know what it was, but and that was a stage in life where I still would have described myself as an agnostic, which I now look upon as a sort of kind of a wussy way of avoiding taking a position, kind of like saying you're bisexual. And I am not an agnostic anymore. It's not that I believe in the God that Michelangelo painted on the ceiling, but I do believe that there is a force larger than any of us that sees, perhaps a way of putting it would be, sees a box beyond our ability to even recognize it, and has an effect on what goes on there, but not in the way that people can only think. They can only think of things happening as if, based on their own experience. So, what is God? God is somebody who is all powerful and he punishes or rewards. That's something we know.
Right.
The idea of a universe in which certain kinds of behavior do lead to more light and certain kinds of behavior do lead to the extinguishing of light, may be true, but it has nothing to do with what we generally think of as good and bad, or punishment and reward.
Mm-hmm.
And I do believe that we are all part of something larger. So far beyond my ken that I don't have to worry about it because I couldn't understand it, and I don't need to. But I can understand. But I can understand that there is certain way of making yourself available so that it can enter your life or invite you into places where you otherwise would not be able to go based on your behavior.
Right.
One of the earliest things I said to it back when I was Mr. Agnostic that happened to stick in my head was the line in the Bible about now we see as through a glass darkly, but then it shall be as face to face. Always struck me. When I was at Princeton, because I was going to be an English major, and I knew that all English literature up until at least the early 1800s and even maybe a little later assumed that everyone knew the Bible from front to back.
Right.
And if you didn't, you would miss a million things in what you were reading. So I took a semester course in the Old Testament and a one semester course in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. And they were taught by believers, but they didn't bring their belief into the discussion it was discussed from a historical perspective. They talked about how all the books of the apostles in many ways contradict each other, how they were based on the language that was used. They were written at different times, and stuff. But I noticed along the way, I thought, there's a lot of stuff in here which is really wise, and that through a glass darkly thing always caught me. My image of it for the longest time was It was as if we saw the world through a dirty window, and there was a way to clean the window. And then I learned shortly, actually, before I started seeing Zeb, that in the earliest Bibles which exist, which were translated into Latin, the earliest ones that exist are in Greek. And in Greek, the word that was used for glass was the word that meant mirror. That it was the closest thing left in present English would be Alice through the looking glass.
Right.
And mirrors at that time, because they had now learned how to make flat glass in mercury back end, for they were hundreds of years away from that. They were made from metal, which was polished as as brightly as they could, but it was never you could never get a completely um, high faith image. It was always distortion because you could never get it perfectly flat.
Right. Lower fidelity.
So,
Right.
so lower fidelity. So what it was saying was, what we see now is a distortion of reality. And then added to it, although it didn't say it that way, is what you're looking at is a distorted version of yourself. It's not a window.
Yep.
Even though it doesn't say that, at least that's how I interpreted it. And I thought
I interpreted that the same way.
and it reminded me. I think I've mentioned this before. I think it was Virginia Woolf who said, "We do not see things as they are. We see things as we are."
Yes, and that's
and I really love that phrase. And then it went on into a whole bunch of other stuff. And part of that stuff was was a chapter or verse or whatever it is, but it was about the concept of caritas, caritas in Latin, which has been it's the word that has been very clumsily translated into charity in English, but in English, charity has come to mean giving things to people who need things that you have that they don't.
Right.
Caritas meant a deep, loving connection with other living beings. And there's a whole series of sentences that says, you may know all things, you may prophesy all things, you may understand all things, but if you have not caritas, you know nothing. Mm-hmm. You may give away all that you have to the poor, but if you have not caritas, you have given nothing. And it still sends a chill up my spine just to say it.
Yeah.
And then at the end, it came to a part where when I first read it, I think I was still a drunk. That said, now I know in part, but then I shall know, even as I am known. And it was the even as I am known part that I thought, well, that won't be happening. I couldn't imagine it. I mean, I really couldn't imagine it for me. And in the course of, there was a day I came in to Zeb's office, and I told you he comes from this, heavy duty Baptist family, so he knows this stuff forwards and backwards. Mm-hmm. And I said, it was after I'd met Charlie and had fallen for the first time in love, allowed myself to fall in love, even though it was with the wrong person. It was still love. Mm-hmm. I said, I think I found something. And and of all places I found it is the Bible. Because he knew, that I was, I was not a religious person. Mm-hmm. And it was the rest of that chapter after the third last article. I said, I think this may be it. That this may be the it that is the path that I was supposed to be on. And
Well,
he just smiled.
I did.
And now, and I, I changed from being someone who thought that their safety was in remaining closed and hidden, with
Mm-hmm.
plenty of good reason, because when I was a kid, that was the safest place to be. But
Mm-hmm.
I carried it into adulthood, assuming it's just the way it always was. And I turned into a person who has discovered that their safety only exists in openness and honesty. And I can let myself be known in ways I couldn't imagine a few years ago. And inevitably, when you do it, another human being opens up. It's like you're priming a pump.
Yeah.
It's a gianter version of, like I told you, with Sina Sinatra and my saying to her, "Right now, I'm afraid of you."
Mm-hmm.
It's that when you show someone your real self, it gives it makes them feel safer showing their real self, because you have displayed weakness without a backup plan.
Right.
You don't have a way to, you haven't left yourself any wiggle room.
Right.
You know, um, uh, I don't go around advertising that I'm an ex-drunk, but there are times when I'll want to say something which only makes sense in the context of the change that happened. And
Right.
I'll say, look, something you don't know about me is I'm an ex world-class drunk. I like to think of myself now as a world-class ex-drunk. This
Mm-hmm.
21 years ago, but nevertheless, I
Mm-hmm.
was putting down a bottle of vodka a day. 9.5 times out of 10, the other person either has a story of substance abuse, has a story of living with it, or has some story in their life that involves a kind of secret shame or dependence that they don't feel comfortable talking to people about.
Right.
That all of a sudden it seems okay to talk about. I,
Yeah.
I don't remember how I got started on this, Michael.
Well, I
I
do. I've been holding the whole thread. Um,
Okay.
and I want to bring it back to
But
that
it was
because,
it's the and people have different truths.
mm-hmm.
It isn't like everybody's going to come to the same one.
Right.
But 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 there are certain bedrocks, I think, which are required, and one of them is kindness. It's you may stumble in your kindness. You may misunderstand another person and think you're being kind when you're not. But but openness without taking into account how you are affecting the other person, and
Well, and
doing so in a way that involves caritas, I is something that has to be part of the process.
I tried to distill that down to even a finer point. And I don't know if this is connected or not. I just suspect, which is before you have caritas, before you believe in kindness, you believe in survival. And there's a connection between the concept of survival and uh, caritas. And that is that even if I 100% believe in my way of thinking, there's a very fundamental level where I know that somehow and in some way, those other ways of thinking are going to save my bacon at some point. Not maybe personally, not like it's going to benefit just me, but that if I have the drive to, you know, have humanity survive, or if I have the drive to have my children have a better life, or if I have the drive to have me and mine, do better, I know that that we have to be able to resist threats to survival. And
Have to exist what?
we have to be able to resist threats to our survival.
Yes.
And my way of thinking at an instinctual level, I don't know if I have all the tricks I need to resist any and all threats. So there's something about connecting with diverse perspectives that matters, or that I can find. Let's say I don't believe in a higher power. Let's say I don't believe in uh, um Caritas. I'm not there yet for whatever reason in my life, in my journey. The thing that you can hook me on is the idea that we want to be able to perceive things that beyond ourselves, that we want to be able to understand the things that maybe understand us better than we understand ourselves, right?
True.
And so, because that's a threat, it also is a wonderful, tremendously cool thing. But if I'm being myopic, it's also a threat. And uh, I'm only talking about this because I'm thinking about, again, Corvox, right? And the types of voices that will come in. And some of them will be on a very different page, right?
Oh yeah.
And so what do they believe in? Well, they could believe in that they've got the right way, that they just need to show everybody the way to get to their place, right? That's a version of somebody's truth out there. And the first thing they're going to want to know is how many people are already thinking like them, and what are the threats to the drift in how to think correctly, right? So imagine again that box, and the Corvox comes back and says, I think I need to split the box into two boxes because it seems like there are really two topics here. Well, if I created that box thinking that that's the way, right? This is the way. I'm going to be paying a lot of attention to that because I'm going to be saying, well, wait a minute, which one's the right box? And which one, therefore, is the threat to the right box? And it's funny, but the kindness and Caritas approach in what I just described is almost absent, right? It's all about threat and wanting to win and all these negative things, but it still gets you down the path to appreciating diversity eventually. It gets you there because you have to survive multiple splits of boxes and boxes joining, right? Another box might come along called something, I don't know, but it has different beliefs contained in it, and so you need to somehow incorporate it or deal with it or react to it as a community. And if enough of you react to it violently, then you temporarily separate for a while. You go a different direction, but it's at least visible. And before, it was invisible. You would never know that because you on average, people will not encounter enough other people in their lives that they trust are, similar perspectives to their own to learn from, right? We're going to be more isolated than
Right.
than ever before. And so if we don't have a tool like this, that isolation turns into, the worst instincts we possibly have.
I think that, listen, one of the things I've learned along the way for me is rather than saying, here's how I think things work, I do a lot better if I just say, here's what I've experienced.
Mm-hmm.
And here's how it's worked for me. It isn't that I mean, it isn't that I love everybody on the planet. There's people I detest. I'm not a saint, but I am aware that my existence is connected to other people's existence in ways that I cannot fully understand, and that hurting other people when you don't have to, and sometimes you do have to for your own survival,
Mm-hmm.
but doing it when you don't have to, and helping other people with their survival when you can, without it becoming a overtaking your own life, actually increases your own chances of surviving well.
Right.
So that it's the opposite of what you think it is. It's not a giving up of something. It's the
Right.
acquisition of resources, like what you're doing right now.
Right.
That it, from a place you didn't expect to find it. You know that I've had a couple of conversations with homeless guys who that have just really sort of changed, in little tiny ways, how I see all homeless people. There was a day when I was a guy who had, he was ragged and unkempt, and it turned out he wasn't dirty, but he looked dirty, and he had a dog always with him that was, and one day he had all his sign said was "We're fucked" on cardboard. And he meant it as a joke, but
Right.
it looked like he might be crazy, like scary crazy. But as I walked by him, something happened with the dog where he said, "What? You want something? Oh, I see. You want a treat. Okay. Well, you know what you have to do then. You have to sit down." And he was having this genuine conversation with the dog, and it was very giving of himself to the dog.
Right.
And I thought, that's not at all what I would have expected.
Mm-hmm.
And the next time I passed him, I stopped and said, "Hello, my name's Larry." And he said, "Hi, my name's Chris." And he's like many homeless people, he's kind of come and gone from the area.
Mm-hmm.
But we had a couple of interesting conversations. And then there was a moment one day when where he hung out kind of on a corner that was near a CVS that was right next to the gym I went to. And he asked me one day if I would buy him some water in the at CVS. He said, "They know me, they'll let me in, but people look at me and get scared." And he reached in his pocket and he took out the change he'd been collecting and started to hand me money to buy a bottle of this particular kind of water we wanted. The old Larry would have said, "No, no, no, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it," thinking I
Mm-hmm.
was doing a good thing.
Right.
I've got more money than he does. He can save his money for other things. What I wasn't factoring into account was his human dignity.
Mm-hmm.
And as he was handing it to me, I stopped myself and I let him do it.
Yep.
I ended up, as he was doing it, saying, "I wonder what people think is happening over here, where a homeless man is handing me money."
Right. Right.
The way I included myself was he gave me enough money for one bottle, and I bought two and gave him
Mm-hmm.
two.
Yep.
But I didn't decide on his behalf what was best for him.
Right.
He was trying to tell me what was best for him,
Right.
you know, and I was about to override it because I knew what was best for him. But in doing that, I was dismissing his existence as an individual.
Yeah. His path, or whatever you want to call it, his dignity. Actually, you gave it the right word.
He actually at one point said something about, that there's certain difficulties that come with the choice I made. He clearly, I know he was picked up once because he was having seizures. I'm sure he was somebody who was in a mental facility, and
Mm-hmm.
had to be let go when he asked to be let go. Very interesting, very bright guy. But it was it, in a number of other ways around that time. I don't know that it was even the first. I became aware that sometimes um, there was a woman who worked at the gym where I went who the story would take forever. She's Armenian, her mom's Armenian. They had like the most evil landlord in the entire world. Their apartment ended up completely flooded. The landlord would have been happy to see them homeless, and eventually Armenians don't turn against each other, and an Armenian lawyer took their case and wouldn't charge them any money because he was embarrassed that a member of his race would do such a thing. But she wrote me at one point and said, "Could we talk at some point? I need to." And I said, "Well, I'm not going to be available for a while, but Teresa, it's fine. Just go ahead, say whatever you need to say. It's perfectly okay." And she asked to borrow $5,000. So that because they had agreed to let the landlord put their stuff in storage. He didn't tell them it was going to cost $35,000 for them to get it out.
Wow.
And I said, I can do that. And in a little over a year, she paid me back.
Nice.
And she said, I want mom and I want to, I've got the money to pay you back and we want to take you to breakfast. And that's what we did. The old me would have taken the money and been very grateful and happy and said, hey, at least let me pay for breakfast. And, but I had reached a point where I thought, it's important to her to be doing this herself.
That's right.
That she has taken care of something herself without help. And I am taking it, I am, she's offering me a gift. And what I am doing when I say, oh no, here, let me take care of it, is I am rejecting the gift.
Right.
And I just didn't used to think like that.
Yeah.
It was actually kinder to her to let her spend money, which was she had a lot less of, than it was to pay for it and remind her of of that difference.
Right. Right.
And it was a change in me, which I'll tell you made Zeb really happy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I struggle with that honestly myself.
But I just never used to think about about that things could be important to another person for a reason other than what's right on the surface, and you're not giving them a chance, to be themselves because you've already decided what's best for them. And that sometimes, you know, it, you know, recognizing someone's need to feel competent and dignified is a huge thing, and it can be a lot more important than who pays for breakfast.
I think what you just said goes even deeper, or at least maybe I'm pushing it that way. But I think that when we say we know how to live well, we don't. We know how we would live well, but there are, and so when you study religions, and I have studied the history of religions to the degree that I've taken a few courses, but the thing that shocked me, or the thing that occurred to me, was that every religion started with this notion that there's a proper way to live. And therefore we'll try to structure the rules to make it possible to live the proper way. And I struggle with that because it is so hard to understand what's beneath the surface of a surface act, like paying for a meal or charity or any of these things. I think that that finding the deeper meaning to an act is more important than a definition of good or bad, as prescribed by a book. Which is not to say that I'm against all religion or anything like that, or that these are not good things, but that I find myself like I try to understand somebody who wants to be a fighter, who just that they've gotten themselves locked into the way of thinking that that they have to fight to be proud of themselves, and this of course causes a lot of problems for themselves as well as the people around them. How do they see themselves as the hero of their story? What is it that we as a culture are gaining from them having lived that arc of their life, regardless of whether or not they end up becoming a less violent person?
Right.
That's the hard part for me. That's the super hard thing for me to fully grasp. And yet, I think it's probably the most important thing for me to grasp. Because if I can grasp that, then I can design a system for that violent person instead of assuming that I'm designing a system to stop them from being violent. That's the difference in the design of the system. And that's very hard for me to accept. Right?
Which part is hard for you to accept?
The hard part for me to accept is that I have to design a system that theoretically could allow a very large number of people to reaffirm to one another that they like being violent people. And maybe the larger system would judge them negatively, but in their pocket of the world, they would be, fine with it. And as long as what they were expressing didn't break the law, I would want my system to be fine with that. Instead of a system, because productive dialogue is productive dialogue. It does not mean that it is correct dialogue. It just means that it's productive. So you can have a productive dialogue of, well, I don't know, I just get some kind of feeling that I'm really alive when I'm in a fight with somebody, right? And I don't understand how to reconcile that with, the rules of the world. And as long as that dialogue was productive, there's potential value to the whole world in it, right? Because then if somebody else suddenly gets a change in their life and they're violent, or they feel like they're violent, not only can they see what that path leads to in terms of its identity and its structure, but also who chooses to leave it and why and how they get out of it, what the paths are. It's almost like a non-judgmental roadmap, right? But in order for the non-judgmental roadmap to exist, you can't judge the people who don't leave a path that you think would be bad. And like I said, as long as the path itself is not breaking the law. So
Yeah, breaking. Yeah, or I would add to that, or hurting an innocent person in a way.
yes, thank you.
Which should not be acceptable.
Right. Yes.
But on a grander scale, it may be that people who think like that serve a necessary purpose in the greater plan.
Right. Like, who am I to know whether they do or not?
And trying to get rid of it actually may seem like it would be a good thing, but that their existence of people like that is there for a reason.
Right. Yep.
That again, you or I may never know. But that assuming, there's an article I read somewhere, I don't think it was Scientific American. It was something like that. It was the question of why has homosexuality persisted in through the period of evolution. You would think if survival of the fittest being defined as those most successful at breeding
Mm-hmm.
was what the direction in which species evolved. Homosexuals would eventually have died out because they serve no purpose.
Mm-hmm.
But they have always, but the percentage of the population which is gay is pretty, as far as they can tell, pretty steady over time, and a tremendous amount of cultural advancement in societies comes out of people who are whose gender preference is their own.
Yeah.
It may be that the drive in a heterosexual that turns into children in a homosexual is turned into art, whether it be a book or a painting or a philosophy or something, and that they serve a cultural purpose in
It's
terms of
just
the,
yeah.
if you look at more of the evolution of survival of the fittest of the whole of society, that they're there for a reason.
Yes. Collectives end up with diversity that could not be explained by the basic rules of competition or Darwinism, right? Dyslexics, homosexuality, psychopaths, right? Um, there's many classifications of humanity that are consistently present through the ages that seem to serve a purpose for the collective rather than for their individual propagation of their genome, right? Um,
Right.
the collective does better because they're in the mix. And if you took them out of the mix, the collective would suffer a major setback,
It's
right?
funny. We've this is it feels to me like we're talking about a much grander version of what we were talking about with hoarding.
It is, in my mind.
You know, that maybe hoarders are needed.
Yeah,
Uh,
but yeah,
you know,
from a sociological standpoint, if you don't have hoarders, then how do you know how much is too much? I mean, I'm being simplistic, but it, it, the logic still follows, right? That they,
the truth is, I mean, I had a conversation once with the woman who is my line accountant, not the guy who runs the company, but a Canadian woman named Sherry. She's done my taxes for years, and I think it was in my early 60s, and I said, we live in a society in which um, it's in the business world, and it's trickled down onto the individual world. If you aren't constantly acquiring more, if you're not getting bigger, if you don't have more factories, if you're not giving bigger dividends, if you haven't got newer products,
mm-hmm,
you're failing.
right,
There's no spot at which you're big
if,
enough.
right.
And
If you're
that's
not
it.
moving
And
up, you
and
are moving down.
I
Yeah.
was in a business in which everybody was trying to get to the next level.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to the level where I liked what I was doing,
Mm-hmm.
and I made I made enough money doing it that I had enough. I
And,
didn't
and
need
and
to,
somehow that's not allowed. It's so weird. It's
and
like
I didn't need to constantly try to have more.
mm-hmm,
I reached a point where my goal simply became to try and preserve what I had.
mm-hmm,
Um, and because I tend to overprotect, because it happens in my personal investments, a lot of them that are in master limited partnerships, which are energy related. And back when oil was $80 a barrel, it was just fine. Nobody thought of the Saudis would bring it down to $3 a barrel. But because as everybody refers to it as the belt and suspenders philosophy, because I you know, compensated just in case. It turns out to be a good thing that I overcompensated, because even though things have dropped a lot, I'm still okay.
Yep.
But Sherry told me later she'd gone home and talked to her husband about it, and she said it sort of changed my life, actually.
Hmm.
The idea that you don't always have to be acquiring more or getting bigger is the definition of success. It's okay to not necessarily want to be president of the company.
Right. And when I was working with some of my developers, because I can only attract young developers who are just getting started right now, because everybody else is deeply embedded in their path. But they would say, "Oh, and I'm trying to do this, and I'm trying to do that, and I'm trying to get to there," and I'd be like, "That's great. You keep doing that. But let me just ask you a question first. What's your I'm set for life number? Not I'm gonna stop, but what's the number where money's no longer the factor, right? Like,
Right.
what's that number?" And they'd say, I don't know what you mean." And I'd say, "Well, every human being has somewhere in the back of their mind this idea of, well, how much money do I need to have? Do I perceive that I need to have, where I wouldn't have to worry about basic survival anymore. Basic survival's off the table. I'm going to have a roof over my head. I'm going to be able to afford medical care and food and, help out a friend if they need help. Like, that's, that. And I get them to tell me what they think that number is. And I say, okay, let's sign a contract that if you work for this company for this small amount of cash that I can pay you now, we'll sign a contract that says if the company reaches these success goals, we'll get you to that number. And if you don't get to that number, it's because the company didn't succeed, right? And they said, well, why? Why do you want to do that? And I was like, because after I pay you this minuscule amount of money, you're either going to stay engaged or you're going to go away. And what I want to do is I want to get 100 of you who stay engaged, who care about whether or not, and I want to become all of your hobby. I want to be your passion project. Because this company is not about getting to the top of the hill faster than any other company. This company is about creating productive dialogue for the planet. And that is, you have to take a turtle strategy when you do that. You can't take the, I'm going to get to the, you can't take a Facebook strategy when you do that, right? And that means my developers, I have to, you're going to find as you go from development project to development project that you're struggling with fulfillment, that you're struggling with why you're doing what you're doing. And what I want to do is I want to catch you on the rebound and remind you that what you really are passionate about is creating a real impact with your code for the world. And so you won't be able to help yourself. You're going to keep coming back. And they kind of are dumbfounded because I'm signing the contract. I mean, and it's complicated. Remember I talked to you about this a long time ago, but I actually finished the contract, and the company, you don't get any payments until the company is at 5 million in revenue with a 20% margin, net profit, and the system has enough capacity to be able to double in the next fiscal year. Those are the 3 rules. And then we have a bunch of ways to measure that so that I can't, rip you off, right?
That's impressive, Michael.
And then what you get is a percentage of the net profits for a certain number of years. Let's say it's 5 years or 10 years, or your magic number, whichever comes first. And if I hire you for another contract, then I've got to add years to that, or I have to increase the percentage, or I have to, right? So every time I hire you, you're deeper in the stake. And then I also reserve the right to come back to you and ask you to donate some percentage of your potential earnings back to hire another developer who gets it, who's going to join the family. And so I have 100% of the net profits to spend over 10 years. And that could equal 100 or more developers, depending on, what relationships I make and who joins the fold and who they bring into the fold as a result of finding their passion, right? Um, and so that's the way I've designed the contract. And
Boy, I
so
could
far,
see that really confusing people.
well, the funny thing is the developers are all for it because to them it sounds like an algorithm, right? They're like,
It sounds
oh,
like a what?
an algorithm,
Oh,
right?
oh yeah, okay.
It's an
And
algorithmic contract, basically. They're like, oh,
I
okay,
guess it is actually. I,
yeah,
it's it's interesting. It took me a long time. I used people it would say something about well you would I doesn't matter to you, you're rich. And I said I'm not rich. And they say, well, what I said, well, what do you mean? I said rich is when you don't have to work.
right,
And then one day I realized I didn't have to work.
yeah. And then you're like, oh,
But accepting the idea that I actually met my definition of rich
mm-hmm,
sort of scared
mm-hmm, terrifying.
me. Because it had been something I'd always assumed would never happen. And I didn't like lie awake at night trying to figure out ways to make it happen. I just didn't think it would.
Mm-hmm,
Um, but then, after I left Hallmark and my lawyer said, do I need to find you another job? And I said, not now.
mm-hmm,
And after a while, I realized I had as much money as I needed to do the things that I like to do. I
mm-hmm,
don't particularly want a Lamborghini.
right.
Uh, I liked my Honda. And I still have one. I
By the
think I
way,
told you.
I
It was
still
it was
love that Honda. The years that we owned them, the 80s and the 90s, that
uh-huh.
they were the best. I still wish I had a
I
perfect
Yeah,
one.
they have there's things about them that have improved, but they're not quite as nothing ever goes wrong with them as they used to be. And partly it's because I think so much more of them is electronic now,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
that it isn't like a mechanic can look inside and go, oh, it's your fan belt.
right.
They have to hook a machine up to it that will give them a readout, which may or may not identify the problem. But nevertheless, I think I told you, I found out after I was no longer, actively working, that it was actually a subject of discussion
Mm-hmm,
among people in the TV movie business, that when I reached the level of senior vice president, I drove a 4-door Honda
mm-hmm.
because it was just so not done.
Well, and I want you to know, Larry, that by the time I made it to senior vice president at Laureate, I was driving a Honda, and it was the subject of discussion amongst the upper ranks. Like, why is he still doing that? So I followed that exactly.
And when people would sometimes ask, and I'd say, well, I my very first car after the Buick Skylark, which my dad gave me, and when I went to grad school, it was a 1966 model, which I had until, God, I guess I had it till like 82. When my very first car that I bought out here was an entry level BMW. It was a 2-door BMW. Back whenever it was like $23,000. And at least every 6 months, it needed some sort of work done on it.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, the only dealership around here was in Santa Monica, and I'd have to drive there. And simply driving on the lot would cost $300.
Right.
And after a couple of years of that, I got tired of it, and decided, and the next car I bought was a Honda. And I got rid of it after 11 years only because I wanted a new car. It was still working just fine.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, why would I want a car that the second you drive it off the lot, it loses 40% of its value,
Mm-hmm.
and that I'm going to be going back and forth getting fixed all the time.
Right.
If I had to drive to San Francisco 3 times a week, maybe I'd like a Lexus that I could settle in and feel like I was in the womb.
Mm-hmm.
But I 6 miles is a big trip for me.
Right.
It served all the functions I needed from a car, one of which was not status.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't, you know, I didn't look for status in stuff.
Right.
In fact, I didn't. I like to think I didn't look for status at all. I guess I did look for positions from which I would be able to have authority, which I guess in a way is status.
Well, yeah, it
But
was
it was
necessary.
for a purpose.
Right.
I didn't. I never felt that the things you owned said something about your worth as a human being. That it was more likely that if you were surrounded by things that were only expensive because they were expensive, not because they were better than, a Louis Vuitton purse is not any better made than, you know, another one which is 1/10 the cost.
Right.
What it tells me about you is actually something which to me is negative.
Right. That's how we were brought up, or that's the values that we connect with.
Because it seems wasteful.
Right.
And also it assumes, I think, does somebody think other people think they're really so stupid that they'll think more of them because they own a certain, there's some shoemaker who's Christian something, who's his brand mark is the bottoms of his shoes are painted red, and a
Very
pair of shoes
specific red. Yes.
and a pair is like $7,000.
Yes.
Yeah,
Kathy has told me all about them.
and I would think, and people want them so that other people go, wow, she's got a pair of, whatever these things are. And I would think, when you think what you could do with $7,000, if you don't need it, there are people out there who don't have food. It's appalling. There's nothing to be admired about it. It's appalling.
This is a perfect topic for us to use in the future, if we can, because you and I see eye to eye on this. However, the world of fashion doesn't. Right?
No, it doesn't.
And the world of fashion, I believe, has a point to make, and it's not that we'll ever believe otherwise, right? Like I don't think I'll ever change my opinion of what you just said, which is that I agree wholeheartedly. But I know that fashion matters, not for the reasons that for reasons that I disagree with, and yet they make society function. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you're right. Did you ever see The Devil Wears Prada?
Oh yeah, and
Do you remember the scene in which Meryl Streep there's the sort of hapless young thing from the hinterlands in her cardigan sweaters, who's and ends up trying to find whatever. I get always the Harry Potter book that that isn't available, and she does it, but Meryl Streep playing, I guess, Anna Wintour, at one point happens, blunders into her and has a conversation with her and looks her up and down and says, "You think you're beyond all this, don't you?"
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me tell you about the clothes you're wearing, and goes through how what she is wearing is as an iteration of some very high fashion item from 4 years ago that has gone through various stages of being dumbed down until it became what she is wearing. And she is absolutely as much a slave to fashion as anybody else. She just doesn't know it.
Well, and fashion, by definition, is trying to push the envelope of differentiation, right? What does it mean to say that I am different than you, right? How do I know people who belong to the royalty versus people who are not royalty? In medieval times, that was pretty simple, right? I could afford clothes that you couldn't, period, ever in your entire life. And that's why when I rode up on a suit of armor, you believed me to almost be a mythical being, right? But in modern times, that need hasn't changed. I need to be able to differentiate myself from you. And if I don't
Yeah, yeah,
constantly push the envelope of what that means, I won't be able to do it. You'll always catch up to me, right? And I can't have a functioning society in my mind if, and I don't mean my mind, I mean the person I'm intimating with my speech here. Uh, I can't have a functioning society if I can't tell the difference between the elite and the non-elite.
well, you just reminded me of something and I lost it while you
Oh,
were
I'm
talking.
sorry, but
Well, it's not your fault.
yeah, but I'm
I,
trying
I,
to. But
I,
I have a
but,
hard time with that statement,
but
but I think it's
um,
true.
no, no, I think you're right. I mean, it does serve a purpose.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the world is employed because people have been convinced that you can't be wearing a color that everybody was wearing 3 years ago.
Right.
And it, it, it it's a little bit like we were saying about like homosexuality
Mm-hmm.
or psychopaths that it, it's if you look at it more in a as of a hive mentality or a high it serves some purpose
Yeah,
or it wouldn't have or it would have petered out along the way
that's right. We
so
we would have gotten
it,
rid of it sometime after the mass production of cloth.
and there are periods in time when certain things take on disproportionate importance, and I think we may be living through one of those when
Yeah.
it comes to you know the acquisition of well, I know here good. Um, I think I've told you that that I've written some stuff on Quora.
Yes. Yes, and I keep
Well,
meaning to go and read all the stuff that you've written on
well,
Quora.
do when you can. But I have like I, I'm slowly moving in on 1 million views.
Hmm.
However, out of those, 700,000 of them are the answer to one question, and the question was, what one thing screams upper class?
Mm-hmm. That
And,
makes sense.
my answer, which I went on at some length about, being a kid from a public high school who went to Princeton, was genuine members of the upper class do not scream anything.
Mm-hmm.
That genuinely upper class people do everything they can not to be noticed.
Yes.
There's a difference between being rich and being upper class.
Perfect.
And I quoted some wonderful stuff that had happened at Princeton. Like I remember a kid said to me once, I don't know how the conversation came up. It was about like furnishing your first apartment when you graduated. He said, a gentleman gets his furniture from the attic. um, and the perfect friend of mine named John Benham, who was an actor and a trust fund baby, but not that kind of guy. He made
Uh-huh.
he made the best parody of that whole way of thinking. Where I think it was I don't know, which it was our 25th reunion or something. And one of the questions they wanted you to answer for your submission was, "What's the most unusual thing you've ever done?" And John's answer was, a gentleman does not do unusual things, which so sums up a particular kind of person that we met
Yep.
there that it still strikes me as genius.
Oh, perfect. It's it's I think that that's an interesting thing that we could get some fashion people on the show here. Um,
And
maybe
there are
we'd
people
start.
who, and there are people I will say that I know who are not just shallow status seekers,
No, yeah,
who
yeah,
are, you know, it's a passion with them.
yeah. I want to get a
Design,
self-aware. I want to get a self-aware fashionista,
yeah, yeah,
right?
design to them is, I mean, to a certain extent, it is with me too. I mean, when I'll spend 2 years looking for an end table.
Mm-hmm.
The first 2 years I lived in New York, Michael, I did not own a lamp
Because you
because
didn't
I
find the
could
right
not
one.
any lamp that I could afford I detested. And so, and so I had a black and white TV that I'd inherited from my parents on a rolling cart, and I would roll it next to the bed and use it as the light to read by.
It's amazing.
I
And
sort of thought of, I always thought of it as sort of my version of the Lincoln reading in front of the fire story.
the the funny thing for me is, I think about the answer to that question that you gave, and what I think about is what would make somebody who's actively trying to hide that they're upper class, I'm sorry, elite, whatever you want to call it. I'm sorry, sometimes I mix my words. But makes them groan when they see it. Like, you see a family arriving for their summer vacation, and there's just things they say and do, or the way they think about things, and it makes you go, oh, right? Like a sitcom comedy, like Malcolm in the Middle, right? Was
Right,
constantly playing on this idea of he's a genius level intellect, but he's being raised with this family, right? And
right,
Bryan Cranston would constantly, sort of hit the punchlines, and I'm interested in the answer to that question. Like, I'm actively not trying to advertise that I'm elite, and yet there are things that make me groan, that make me shrink away, that make me. I need to still be a put together person, whatever that
right.
means. What is a well put together person? And that's very hard for me because I was raised on a farm in upstate New York. My family had zero fashion sense. Every photo of me had stripes and plaid mixed.
No,
From dawn to
I've got some pictures like that too.
yeah,
Um,
and I just had fashion to me was something that came only as an absolute necessity when I started to climb the ladder, and I realized that people would
right.
judge you harshly if you entered the room like a slob. And so I had to
I think maybe I told you
learn
that
that.
when my father worked for Raytheon,
Mm-hmm.
which I guess still exists. He wasn't there very long because he wasn't very happy there. But
Mm-hmm.
he left General Electric and took a quite high level job with Raytheon. And apparently, within the first month of his working there, he went to work in the uniform like everybody else, but he wore Argyle socks. And he was actually called into his boss's office and told that if his intention was to, continue to move forward in the company, he might rethink his socks.
Wow. Although I've had the same thing happen to me at Microsoft, which you'd think would be one of the most casual places ever, right? I mean, you have engineers walking around in t-shirts, but those are $1,200 t-shirts.
Right.
Okay, and so, and I was working for the part that did executive engagement, and so I was informed on several occasions uh, that I needed to, oh my gosh, we're overheating. I don't know if you noticed, but I flew a little too close to the star, and so now I'm stuck trying to get the right distance away from the star on low energy systems. I can't go faster than light, and it generates too much heat trying to get away. So if I hit go faster than light, you'll see on the left hand side of the circle area in the middle, I'm going to say go, and that temperature is going to start rising. And it's rising faster than the engine is charging up. And so now it's going to start doing damage to the ship, and I have to turn it off and let the temperature go back
Okay.
down. And
Well,
so,
and I'm sort of overheating too,
okay, all right.
and if it's okay with you, we'll sign off for today.
Absolutely, Larry. This was wonderful. Thank you so much. This is
Yeah, it was.
episode
It
8.
was.
I think we just did 8. Here, let me
It
just get
was.
one shot of you before the end. And if I could get you to just say, this is the wrong show signing off or something like that. I don't know.